what we began to call secondary trauma, and that we don't have to be the survivor of the traumatic event, but that having someone that we love and interacting with them on a day-to-day basis and kind of witnessing their struggles can be as traumatizing for family members as it is for the individual trauma survivor.
Today, Jerry joins me in the third of our Supra Conference series, where we talk with Dr. Mark Barnes about trauma, PTSD, how the family is affected by addiction, and what they can actually do to support the person who is struggling. If you or a loved one struggles from addiction, you won't want to miss this interview.
Real life for real families. Hurts, habits, and hang-ups happen in every family.
Jerry and I are here with tools to help you trust God, clean house, and tell the truth to ramp up the joy in your family.
You have what it takes.
It's time to become sober on purpose for his purpose. Hey, Jerry.
Hey, did you hit record this time?
I hit record this time. Yay me!
All right. All right. Hi, Tanya.
So we are thrilled that you are coming home. And in honor of you coming home, we have a wonderful guest that I met at the Supra conference earlier this month. He is a PhD and is the Chief Clinical Officer for the Foundry Treatment Center, Mike Barnes. And he worked...
Wait, what other... I know there was a number of other letters that preceded...
Oh, he's got all kinds of letters. He's a PhD in MAC and an LPC. So he's got all kinds of letters. But his work, when I heard his work, I went, oh, that just clicks. You and I have talked a lot about why divorce happens after sobriety, when you've been wishing and hoping and praying for that. And he just made that click on family systems. So, Mike, I'm excited. Toss it over to you, let you introduce yourself. And your material is so rich, let you start wherever you want to start.
Okay, well, thank you for having me on. This is awesome. So I've been in the field of addiction for 35 years, been a college professor, I've run programs, but I guess the place to start would be probably in 1991, our son was hit by a car when he was 5 years old. And that started, for me, a process of beginning to look at what is the impact of these really significant events on how families operate and how families function on a day-to-day basis. And I really began to study what we began to call secondary trauma, and that we don't have to be the survivor of the traumatic event, but that having someone that we love and interacting with them on a day-to-day basis and kind of witnessing their struggles can be as traumatizing for family members as it is for the individual trauma survivor. And then as I kind of left academics and moved back into treatment, really began to look at what is the secondary trauma for the family members of someone who is living with an active addiction. And so that really began the process of the presentation that you heard, which is really beginning to help family members move beyond the idea that A, it's not my problem, it's my loved one's problem, and B, if they would get sober, then we could go back to normal. And the reality is that over the course of time, as families begin to deal with the trauma symptoms and their own fears and anxieties of what if this never gets any better? And what if we have to live with this for the rest of our lives? What if he or she, the person we love, gets so sick from this disease that it just increases the pain and the fear? Or what if they die? Think of the opiate addiction, opiate overdose deaths that are rampant, and twice as many people die from alcohol every day as from opiates. So we don't even talk about that. So
one of the things that really caught me is you described different types of trauma and how that affects the family. Can you put definitions to that for us?
I mean, there are a lot of different things that I could talk about there, but, the idea of the primary survivor. So there are 4 ways that we could be traumatized. One is to be a survivor of a traumatic event. One is to witness a traumatic event. One is to learn about someone that we love who has experienced a traumatic event and then to have to deal with it. And then the fourth, and I think this applies to families all the time, is to be living on a day-to-day basis with active trauma symptoms, active trauma experience, trauma reminders, that all of those apply to family members. I know when our son was hit, my wife was standing, there and witnessed the event. I didn't witness it, but I had to live with it. So I had experienced a pretty significant traumatic event. And when you look at, it's interesting, I show, when I do my lectures with families, I show a picture of a mobile over a baby's crib, and I kind of try to get them to understand how the impact on one of those members actually causes the whole thing to begin to move and shift and to adjust. And that over the course of time, as the addiction gets worse, as the symptoms get more severe, as the fears get more, that mobile begins to shift and to stay into a new normal, that even with sobriety, we're not going to go back to how things were before the addiction. Mm-hmm. That we need to move into a newer normal. I always say that that normal ship has sailed, that it's time for whole family healing. And if you ask a family member how long it takes for them when their loved one walks in the front door to determine whether that person's impaired or not, the average answer is 2 seconds. And so with that evolution of living with this active addiction comes the need for a sense of hypervigilance, a sense of control.
I was thinking, Mike, I kind of had an epiphany listening to both Tanya kind of give me the talking points that you had made when she saw you speak, and listening to you now. When an addict recovers from their addiction and they return back to the family unit, I think it is very common to kind of expect things to go back to, a quote unquote normal. But if we had somebody, say, who had a trauma that caused them to be paralyzed, we would never say, when are things going to be normal again, right? Mm-hmm. It's just so obvious. But in these other areas of addiction and dependence, I think it's less obvious. So it's really enlightening for me.
It's interesting. If the illness was a short-term acute illness, like a broken bone or something, the family doesn't have to change very much. But given the fact that it's a long-term chronic illness, the family is evolving and changing just like the addicted individual is. And if you ask the family, and I ask the families this all the time, okay, your loved one's been sober for 2 years and you haven't seen them for a while, and they walk in the front door of the house, how long does it take for you to determine whether they're intoxicated or sober? And it's the same 2 seconds. And the idea is that the person who is in recovery is making these changes on a daily basis, but the family may not be making those same changes. And that actually creates more conflict in the family when the individual who is in recovery comes home and they're treated the same way they were, with that level of hypervigilance and that level of assessment, as they were when they were using. And that's one of those things that creates, that's where the new normal needs to come.
And you talked about, and Jerry and I talk about this quite often, of waiting for the other shoe to drop, that they may be sober 3 months, they may be sober 3 years, and the family hasn't changed.
Well, that's true. And I can certainly empathize with families, having grown up in a family with lots of other issues, the idea of, but if they do go back to using, then I need to have those defenses available to be able to live. And so I certainly understand that. But the research would tell us that the more the family heals as a unit, the more likely that person is to stay sober in the long run anyway. And so holding on to those creates a sense of dis-ease for the recovering person as they're interacting with the family. And it's like, should I just go back to being who they expect me to be? And that's why I think a lot of people do relapse, because it's too hard to live in two worlds. Or other families, or in other families, the recovering person basically begins to spend all their time in 12-step, and they actually, I call it stay and leave. The idea of, I'm going to stay in my family, but for my emotional support and for my well-being, I'm going to leave and go get it somewhere else. And so again, if the family goes into recovery, then the person can get their self-help support through 12-step, but also within their family system. And so that's the new normal that we talk about.
So the family's been hoping and praying and desiring for this person to get well. Why do they choose to stay stuck? What is it that that compels them to kind of stay where they are?
So from a purely neuroscience perspective, we know that when someone's traumatized, that certain aspects of what we call the limbic system of their brain, the part of the brain that actually focuses on keeping them safe, begins to change. And so if we really understand secondary trauma, it's not just the client who has this change. It's the client, it's their partner, it's their parents, it's their siblings, their kids, all have these kind of needs for safety. And when I was teaching at the University of Colorado, I had a student once ask me, what's it like to work with an unmotivated client? And I said, well, I don't know. I've never worked with an unmotivated client. And the whole class laughs. And I said, most of my clients are pretty highly motivated to stay the same.
That's the real funny part, is we are highly motivated to stay the same.
And I think what that takes away is this judgment of motivated clients are good and unmotivated clients aren't, and moves it into the idea that we're all motivated to stay safe. And so if safety means being hypervigilant because the potential for this person to relapse is so scary to me, then I'm going to maintain those defenses rather than make the changes and take the risk to change and then getting hurt again. And so I think that's why so many people begin to make that, or fail to make that shift, is that they have the same PTSD symptoms and trauma symptoms. We call it codependency in the field, but if you put the definition of developmental trauma side by side with the definition of codependency, they're the exact same thing. And so over the course of time, I was going to say, over the course of time, there is an element of developmental trauma of living with someone who struggles so much that their needs have to take precedent over my needs.
So what steps can a family take to help the addict to be, or the person in recovery from chemical addiction? What steps can they take to help them to be successful?
So the first thing I would say is accept the need for family recovery, and the idea of, it's not my problem. Well, every family that I've ever worked with has huge problems. We call them build-up stressors, the idea that if it was just the addiction that we were dealing with, it may not be so hard, but it's addiction, financial problems, employment problems, physical problems, so that the families need to recognize that I'm not just dealing with their problem. I have a day-to-day problem in and of itself. The second is being willing to look at their own family history. There's a book called It Didn't Start With You, and the idea that many family members are bringing histories of their own family addiction, family traumas, illnesses. The research tells us that if someone has cancer, that the family members get traumatized, that if someone has a heart attack. And so when we begin to look at the number of families that when we really begin to dissect the family members' histories, we find that there's multiple traumas in their lives that actually complicate how they deal with their loved one's addiction. So the second one is being willing to look at themselves and to be willing to look at their own family history and begin their own process. It's amazing how many families we tell to go to Al-Anon, that they never go. And the idea, so families will often say to me, what do you think we should do? And I used to tell them. And now I say, if I tell you, will you do it? And they
say,
and people always think that they're going to say yes. And they very rarely ever say yes. They never say no. They almost always say, well, it depends on what you tell me.
What's the investment in keeping the addict using, or keeping the addict kind of in their dependencies, or whatever?
Yeah.
So
what benefits the family by doing that?
So the benefit is not in the person using, that's for sure, but it's the benefit is in predictability. And that if you behave in a way that I expect you to behave, then I can trust you. And family members all the time say, I just wish my loved one would be honest with me. And so I say to them, what if the honesty is, I want to use so bad I can taste it? Mm-hmm. I'm really struggling right now. I'm triggered. I'm this far from relapse. And the family's eyes get big and it's like, holy cow, what do you do with that? And I said, so there's certain things that they need to be honest with you about. in terms of relationship, but there are certain things that they need to work out in their 12-step meetings, where saying that same thing in a 12-step meeting, everyone's head nods and goes, "Yep, you're in the right place. So have a seat, get a cup of coffee, and let's move forward with this." Where families, that level of honesty about their addiction often creates a control response. Their fear gets so great that they want to say, "Well, let me take care of this for you." And I really believe that that's the root of enabling, is really about the fear of the family. A, that the person will die if they don't enable, or that the things will get worse if they don't enable. But at the very core foundation, that they experience this autonomic nervous system reactivity. They get anxious, they get terrified, which the only way to make that go away is to either be able to truly self-soothe and allow trust your loved one is going to do what they need to do in their recovery, or take control of the situation. That's where enabling, that's where overinvolvement, enmeshment, all of those things that we talk about, I think, are based on the trauma response.
And you just nailed it for codependency. I mean, you just said it in another way of, I need to control the situation for you so that I'm okay, because I don't know how to soothe it for myself. Or if you're not okay, then I'm not okay. Jerry, this is why I was so blown away in listening to him. I had like 15,000 thoughts at the same time. And Jerry and I have talked about that. One of the reasons that there may be an investment in keeping the addict or the person who is sick is because I don't know how to behave any other way. My role in your life, or my role in my life even, is to take care of you, or to manage the whole family, or control the situation. And so if you change, then who am I?
It's really true. That's exactly right. And so where does that come from? Does that come from the act of addiction and living with this person who needs to be in recovery? Or have I been enabling in my family since I was a little kid? Mm-hmm. And so that's the piece that I really think is imperative, that when Jerry says, well, what should people do? And that idea of, am I willing really truly to look at my behaviors? I've been doing this since I was a child. My dad was an alcoholic. My father was not an alcoholic, but I hear it all the time. My dad was an alcoholic, and there are certain things I had to do as a kid in order to be safe. And those are the same things I do now. I take responsibility for people. I enable people. And so often we say, well, the addict's needs have to come first. But in reality, the family members' need for peace, need for an element of control is actually what's being played out.
Mike, I've often thought that when you have a family dynamic with an addict, which is kind of in the center of the equation, in my experience, the family is often saying that if the addict would just get sober, then everything would be well. Well, in the situations where that does happen, and the addiction has been miraculously removed, that the problems in the family dynamic don't go away, and that causes a lot of stress on the family, because either they have to begin to look at what were the roots of these problems, which may not have been the addict, or they have to start looking at what their role was inside of the family dynamic. Would you say that is accurate? Can you expand on that if you think so, or contradict it if you don't?
No, I think that's absolutely correct. I think that the assumption is always that we're reacting to the addiction, and certainly that's the case. But there's also family history that, we look at 3 generations. It's not unusual for a client to say to me, well, my parents weren't addicted. And I always say, well, then which one of your grandparents was? And say, oh, well, my mom's dad was. And so these ideas that are sort of transgenerational struggles are often lost on the family. And they clearly think that if you would just get sober, then we would be fine. But in reality, they're not just reacting to your addiction. They're reacting to fear and threat and uncertainty and autonomy and boundaries that had been set generations before that are now continuing to be played out and lived out. And, and I just want to say that I talk about this in a fairly matter-of-fact way, because, that I've been doing this for so long, but I really do respect how hard it is to make those changes. This is not an easy thing. I want to be respectful, but
I think where we're going is sobriety is not the silver bullet. And in a sense, we belong to a Celebrate Recovery program to where we have shirts that say we are those people. We have hurts, habits, and hangups. In a sense, every family, you talk about the car accident with your son, which please share with our audience that your son is okay. That always hurts my mother.
Oh, yeah. I wanted to ask that too.
Sure. No, he's absolutely fine. Father of 2 little kids, an attorney living in Tampa, Florida. He's doing great.
Okay. But your example was not about, it was trauma without the whole addiction side to it. That I look at it as, okay, we say the silver bullet is sobriety. The person or persons get sober, and then they come back into what all families have to deal with. So we're not that different from any other family.
No. So that's really a good point. It's funny. I always tell families, if there was a silver bullet, we would have shot your loved one when they walked in the front door. And there is no silver bullet. And the idea that, there's a concept in AA that they talk about normies. And I always struggle with that term a lot, because I tell our clients when they use that term, I want to be normal. I always say that guy that's walking down the street that you think is normal may have stage 4 brain cancer, and you have no idea what he's going through. Or he may have just lost his wife, or his father may have just died. I said that the most normal people in the world are the people who struggle and who persevere and who on a daily basis struggle to use coping strategies to get through the day. And so, families in recovery are, they deal with a lot of very painful issues, but they're not that different from other families that have a kid with cancer or have a kid, with a debilitating disease. So the process is actually remarkably similar. The symptoms may be pretty radically different, but it's...
Yeah, I want to jump in there, Mike, because we do use the concept of normies, but in my experience, it's just to constantly remind the addicts that there is no such thing as normalcy. So we say that normal is a setting on a washing machine, right? That's the only time you see normal, right? Yeah. And because the inclination is always, as the addict, to separate yourself out from the rest of society, like I'm the only one who has to deal with this. That's one of the reasons, I'm sure you're familiar with that recovery groups have success, is because they surround themselves with people with very similar experiences, right? Mm-hmm. But yeah, so that in my understanding is always just a way to just bring us back to the reminder that there is no normal. There are no normies. Everybody struggles. And hence the familiar term normie.
Yeah. No, I agree. As long as that's the understanding, that's we're in full agreement. One of the things that we talked about at the beginning, we were talking prior, was like why divorce happens when the recovery happens. And it's been my experience that it happens because both people are fairly traumatized, and the idea of being able to have... So there's a model of therapy that I use that used to be called CAR, Containment and Autonomic Regulation Therapy, which no one understood what that meant, but it was really about helping traumatized people begin to manage their nervous system and begin to deal with the fears. And it's really complicated because we go through different memory states as we get more and more anxious. And so if the couple can't learn to communicate with each other, to trust one another, and trust doesn't mean if I leave a $10 bill on the table that it'll be there when I get back. Trust is I can be me with you without consequence, and that we can work through these issues. That the recovering person tends to find people in AA that they can begin to have those conversations with. And this growing idea of I can talk to you about things that are really going on in my life that I can't talk to my wife about, or I can't talk to my husband about. And so that's been my experience, why relationships begin to deteriorate, because we're talking about really complicated and really difficult changes. So that idea of I'm really mad at him for the things he did when he was using, well, those are things that are going to need to get resolved. And if they don't get resolved, then there are other people in the world that we tend to find like-minded people.
I can trust that if I leave a $10 bill on the table, it won't be there when I return.
we have children.
Yeah.
And so that leads us back to the family and the PTSD and getting well. Of your suggestion of going to Al-Anon is that, like you said, the spouse may not need to know everything and may not be able to connect with everything, but they need to be aware of what their triggers are and to say, that's too much. I can't handle all of that. Or I think something that our therapist really worked with us on was the self-soothing.
Mm-hmm.
So you talked about in the presentation that I heard about a wellness narrative, about a healing story. How do you help couples or families begin to create that once the addict has moved into sobriety?
So once the couple can begin to have conversations without constantly having a reaction to it, where they can really begin to have conversations. So in trauma work, we work on safety first, then we work on telling the story, and then we work on how do we take that story and reintegrate into society and like into our normal world. So safety is that every time I say to my partner, I'm really struggling, that person can have a non-reactive response and to be supportive and to let the person, what do you think you need to do? So let's use our programs and let's move forward. And so once that's the case and people can begin to have really difficult conversations, then my mentor, a guy by the name of Dr. Charles Figley, who's at Tulane University and their School of Social Work, wrote the first book on families and trauma. And he came to the conclusion that there are these 5 healing questions. Mm-hmm. What happened? Why did it happen? Why did it happen to us? Why did we react the way we reacted when it happened? And what will we do in the future if anything like this were to ever happen again? How do we not put ourselves back in that box? And so, given the fact that when we're in the middle of these, like I always ask couples when they've been arguing, do they remember what they said in the heat of the argument? And almost always it's, well, I have bits and pieces of what was said, but I'll be willing to argue to the death that I was right in whatever was said, of course. And so there's a level of dissociation when we get that anxious, that the blood actually starts leaving our prefrontal cortex, the front of our brain, where reason is and where memory is and where our ability to problem solve is. And so if we can't calm that and allow the brain to function the way it's supposed to function, then answering questions about, why did this happen become really hard to answer. And so,
well, I'm sure glad we have this on recording so we can go back and write those questions down. Yeah, that is powerful. I don't want to cut you off. I'm going to call you Dr. Barnes because I want to talk about something that Tanya and I've been sober now almost, how long has it been? Almost 9 years.
Huh?
Right? 8 years?
Yeah.
Almost 8 years?
Yeah.
Gosh, it's long enough that I can't remember. I'm not doing the math anymore. I mean, I know my sobriety date, but we definitely still struggle with these triggers from our past and being able to talk about. So, for example, if I haven't struggled with cravings in a long time, but if I can imagine that if I was to come home and and just confide in Tanya, I'd say, boy, I have just been really struggling with the need or the want, the desire to use and just calm myself, that would, I would think, trigger her tremendously. In AA, I've heard it said that your wife is not your priest, and that we, as the addict, we need to be very careful about, the things that we bring home to not cause turmoil in the family unit. Can you speak to that at all? I mean, is that a healthy thing in early or in moderate recovery, or is this something that the family needs to be working on from the beginning?
Well, I think it's something that they have to be working on from the beginning. And I think that if both people are actively working in either, like a recovery program or in their own therapy, and as people begin to experience that level of honesty and that level of intimacy kind of growing, then I think what they can talk about will be different than what they would talk about when they can't do that. So in developmental trauma, we talk about working on connection to self and others, the ability to have boundaries, the ability to trust one another, to get needs met. And as we're growing in those areas, then our level of communication increases pretty significantly. It becomes safer to do that. And the other thing I want to say is it's really important for people to remember that both people remember the addiction and remember the traumatic events completely differently. Like,
wow,
my wife and I
never really thought about that.
There's a video of my first wife and I talking about our son's accident, and it's amazing how differently we remember everything and why we argued all the time, because how I remembered it was completely different than how she remembered it. And so that's why when we talk about things like, well, why did this happen? Well, I'm going to have a potentially very different response as to why it happened than my partner's going to have. And so I have to be able to tolerate that she may see me as
wrong.
That she's wrong.
I had to add some levity. This is really good stuff.
Well, and let me jump in. Is not only am I seeing it from my own point of view, but I'm also seeing it. I also bring things to the table, and I harp on this all the time. Is I didn't marry Jerry because I was well. I married Jerry because he put together some of the things that I needed in my life. And that's when I could sit in the Al-Anon meeting and be thankful for my addict, because I wouldn't have grown without it. It was a very surprising statement to come out of my mouth. And what I found so fascinating was that the family story needs to be recreated almost from the ground up, it seems like. Yeah. And you can't do that, at least in my opinion, you can't do that unless you're willing to face your own skeletons in your own closet and say, I brought this to the table. He didn't create that. And so what I would do if he gave that to me, probably the best I could do right now is look at him and go, and then go call my community and say, okay, this is happening, feeling a little out of control. If I were not crazy about this, how could I be supportive? What could I say? Do I just need to stay out of it? To have that outside tank, because my whole body goes at that point.
And I think that's a demonstration of how difficult it is to change that physiological response. And then the other person reacts to that physiological. So think of the mobile again. Mm-hmm. Jerry comes in and he kind of pings the mobile by saying, there's been a change. I'm struggling. And everyone reacts. And then the system shifts around. And now Jerry's reacting to your reaction and you're reacting to Jerry's reaction. And suddenly we're not dealing with the problem that Jerry brought to the system anymore. We're dealing with our own responses to that. And that's where families get into like maintaining, we call them problem maintaining systems in systems theory. The idea that if we can't move beyond reacting to everybody else's reaction, we'll probably never get to changing the situation.
So if one person, so the addict gets sober, that's one change. And if another person in the family changes, how are you moving towards the healing story? I mean, that person can change by moving away. They can change by shutting down. They can change by all kinds of different ways. But how do you move towards answering those 5 questions? How do you move towards safety in that space?
Well, the safety is dealing with the changes. And so it's not just getting sober, it's getting sober, having different opinions, recognizing that they have different needs and that things have to be different in order for me to stay sober and stay in this relationship. And then the family then has a different response to that. So those are what I would call the safety phase, beginning to work on those things. I wouldn't even open the door to why did this happen until we have a pretty, if I were a therapist with a family, I would want to be really clear that they're going to be able to tolerate that level of discussion before I do that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not an early, right off the bat. That might be a year down the road, that it's time to start a new healing theory. And when I think about that process, I always think about if every member in the family had a different color index card, and they wrote all of, like, why did it happen? They write their story on these index cards and talk about things they remember. And then everyone puts all of their cards on the table. Now the family's job is to decide which of all of those things are actually accurate. What's the story that we really believe? What's a healing story rather than a blaming story? And so the process is to have everyone sort of tell the story and to recognize that it's really going to be, like, my wife's story and my story were really different. I wasn't
that absolutely blew me away. And I completely see it now in the past, but had never really made that connection cerebrally that yeah, we see things differently.
Mm-hmm.
And so that leads me to a question, though. So where's the truth?
Well,
where's the actual God's truth in this?
Let me tweak that question. Do you have to come to truth about what happened in the past, or can you come to a semblance of, this is kind of how we understand it, now let's move forward? Where do you have to go to healing?
Good, yeah.
So in therapy, we talk about things like there's a concept called epistemology, and the idea of what is truth. And sometimes the very best we can come to is, this is how I remember it, so it's sort of my truth. And in talking to my wife about the situation, my truth can change. Like, I don't remember doing that. I don't remember saying that, but maybe I did. So let's talk about that as part of a kind of a new truth. And so every person tells their truth or their story. We put all the we don't actually write cards out, but actually it's kind of an interesting idea.
Cool.
To put those all out there. And then we have everyone go and just sort of look at what's all the new information that's on the table, and begin a conversation that says, wow, if I said that, I'm really sorry. I don't remember saying that. But do you realize how scared I was at that point and how desperate I was? And so it opens the door to a very different conversation about what happened. And then ultimately I have the family go home and answer those 5 questions together as a group. So what happened?
They do this without you. They do the 5 questions without you.
Wow. Yeah. Well, they do the initial phase of the 5 questions where everyone is telling their own story with me in the room. Mm-hmm. And then we process all that information. And then the final one, I don't need to be part of. I want you to go home. I want you to take all the information that we've talked about. So what actually happened? Well, we both had a lot of trauma in our childhoods. Mm-hmm. My dad, I was reacting out of what I learned in my family, and you had a lot of trauma, and you were reacting out of what you learned in your family, and the addiction changed the way you saw the world. So why it happened was not good or bad. It's just that, and this is what most people come to, is that the circumstances that brought us together and led us down this path kind of played a bigger role than we thought.
And that's where I think in our faith base, we would say that's where grace and mercy come in that, okay, this is where we are, this is what we've got. And then the next step is, how do we tell the story? Then we have a choice to tell the story we want to tell the narrative we want to tell forward. Am I tracking with that? Is that where they get the choice?
Yeah, it is. And it comes back to that 4th question. Why did we act the way we did when it happened? That we were sort of programmed to respond that way. And then the last question of what will we do in the future? Well, we don't have to act that way anymore.
We have choice, because now we understand.
We have choice. And we also have to understand that our brains have been altered. I don't want to get into all the neuroscience of all this, but trust me, there's a lot of neuroscience, and that I'm going to have really bad days. And I'm going to ask you to be supportive of me during that process, even though you may be triggered and frightened that means I'm going back to my old ways of being. And it doesn't mean that. It means that as a family, we love each other and we need to be able to support each other. And I may need to go to my 12-step support group to get the majority of the help that I need in order to be okay. Are you okay with that? Can you self-soothe enough to tolerate that I'm going to work this out with my sponsor? And then I'm going to let you know that I'm doing that.
This has really turned out to be a tremendous case for optimism. This whole episode that we're doing here has really given me a whole newfound hope, and with just such solid and well articulated tools to go about it. How can people take a more formal approach to getting help for the family? Is this something that you're still doing? Are there other people that you can recommend, publicly, of course? What would you tell to the family that still struggles?
Yeah, I didn't talk about the fact that he's the chief clinical officer at the Foundry Treatment Center in Steamboat Springs. So tell us a little bit more about that. I believe you have a private practice. I don't know if you do video conferencing for your patients as well, but where can they find you and talk to you if this is something that our listeners are interested in?
So I don't have a private practice at this point, but we have connections all over the United States. Our guys, our kind of support team know treatment centers all over, and that if people were to contact, and I'm happy to give my email address and I can forward things on, but it's Mike.Barnes, Barnes, at foundrysteamboat.com. And that we know therapists, and if we don't know therapists, we know people in treatment centers that can help us refer that family to a therapist. So we really see marketing to be much more about community service than about bragging about how good we are, although we think we're pretty good in that same time. And I think what is really important is that people get to treatment in trauma-informed and trauma-integrated environments that understands the family's traumatized too. And because, as we've talked about, like if the family doesn't, so think about everything we've talked about. And if it's adversarial, that the client's mad at their family for putting them here in this treatment program, and that, my problem is my family, and if the family's blaming the client and all of our problems are based on their addiction, you can see how everything that I just said is not going to work. But it's predicated on, as a family, we love each other and we need to heal. There's certain things I have to do, certain things my loved one has to do. But if we trust each other and develop appropriate healing strategies, there should be lots of room for optimism.
And what Jerry said, I think, is so hopeful is you come out of a very non-trusting background. I mean, he's been sober for 9 years. We just had our first budget meeting where we didn't yell at each other. And we've done Dave Ramsey, and we've hired coaches, and we've done all that.
Sure.
But it took a long time to get all of that settled and straightened out. And it was both of our parts. It wasn't just one. So the hope is that you have a system. It takes a lot longer than just a weekend at the treatment center. You have a system where the whole family can go, hey, I have a choice. I don't have to behave like this. And we can be that loving, caring family who shifts when needed. So
living in Steamboat Springs, it's really hard to get families to come here. Like we're not close to anything, really. It's three-hour drive no matter where you are. And so we're just in the beginning phases of building a kind of an online sort of remote family program where, so I'm in the process of doing videos. I just finished a kind of a welcome video to family members that are really about challenging them to look at their treatment needs and recovery needs. So as we evolve those videos, we're happy to share those and let others see those where it's not, it's not proprietary. It's about helping people. So people contact me, we can maybe do a mailing list that would help people as we evolve. get information that at this point we just don't have the ability to get out.
Right. And we would that out to our audience. So Sober on Purpose audience, expect that happening as Mike evolves that out. We'll put out links in the email letters and those types of things, because there's some pieces that I think Jerry and I already had some awareness of, but the articulation was not there. And it certainly isn't mainstream that, hey, the whole family has PTSD. The whole family needs some help here. It is not just the person who's using, and we're not so different from other families who've had trauma. It just is this particular format of it. That's how it works.
And I speak all over the country on this. So it's interesting. There's been a lot of movement in treatment to understand the trauma of the addict and the patient, if you will, the participant. There hasn't been a whole lot of movement on helping families understand that they've been traumatized either in this process or maybe long before this process.
Right. Well, Mike, we can't thank you enough for doing this, and hopefully we can have you back on. We're going to put this out both on the superseminar.com site and on our own website to get it out there as much as possible. I really thank you for your time and for being at that conference. It's just fantastic. I just feel delighted that we're right here in Steamboat Springs.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to second that too, Mike. Such great stuff, and really appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks for having me on. It's been really nice to meet you both.
Hey, Jerry, we talk about living sober on purpose all the time. What is real life for real families?
Well, real life for real families is just dealing with the trials and tribulations of daily life as they come.
But we're also looking for growth, reaching our goals. We've had different things come in our lives that we want to achieve. How have we made that happen?
We work with people who are talented, who we admire, who we want some of their attributes to be imprinted on us.
And that came to us through several sessions of coaching with some international coaches and also some local coaches, which has really changed my life. How has it moved you forward?
Oh, it's definitely given me the ability to have a sounding board and to be able to talk through things that allowed me to figure out where I was and what I wanted, having somebody to help direct me.
And that's where coaching comes into play. I'm Tanya Joya, and I am a recovery coach, someone that helps you get unstuck, figure out what's next, and deal with fear and anxiety after someone in your family gets sober or during the sobriety process. Because people often feel like
the other shoe is going to drop.
And that really is a hard, stuck place. You don't feel like you can move forward with your dreams, with your goals, because you're constantly watching and waiting for something to happen. How about making a change in your life and looking forward? And to learn more about me, hop onto thejoyousfamily.com, The Joyous Family Facebook group, or The Joyous Family Instagram. And I'd love to do a discovery call with you. Just about 15 minutes of your time to see if coaching is right for you. Thank you so much, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Oh, I think you locked up.
Did I freeze him?
He's all locked up on my screen.
Oh, no.